This film is about retrofitting traditionally constructed homes to be resilient to the risk of flooding in the future. Climate change is resulting in increased frequency and intensity of flooding, so it makes sense to try and reduce the stress and costs of your home being flooded. Reinstating lost traditional materials will allow your home to dry substantially quicker than more modern materials. Thus, you can return to your home after only a short period of time, and it may even mean that you do not need to leave at all. To reduce the impacts of climate change, we also need to use less energy in our homes. Measures that look to improve the energy efficiency at the same time as flood resilience will result in a warmer home and reduce carbon emissions. Ways you can do this are explored in our film Improving Energy Efficiency in Traditional Buildings. The measures needed are usually a combination of flood resistance and flood resilience. In this film, we will be discussing flood resilience measures. These aim to minimize the impact caused by floodwaters, reducing or even avoiding the stripping out of damaged fittings, wall finishes, floorboards, and so on. As well as allowing you back into your house sooner, it also reduces waste and carbon emissions. Flood resistance measures aim to stop water getting into the building in the first place, such as floodgates, sump pumps, and the safe location of services. These are looked at in the film Flood, Rain and Damp in Newer Buildings, but they can also be useful in slowing floodwaters in traditional buildings, giving more time to move vulnerable possessions and furniture. To start with, you need to understand how the flooding might affect your property, referred to as flood risk. This covers not only how high the water might reach, but where the water is coming from and how it will drain away. The main sources of floodwater are from rivers having burst their banks with the potential for contaminated water, coastal flooding with potential for contamination from salt water, surface water runoff including roads, hills, fields, paths, rising groundwater, and backing up of the sewers once more with associated contamination. The measures you take to protect your property will depend on the level of risk that your home will be flooded and how the water might enter your home. If you are having more general problems with damp to your walls, ceilings or floors, particularly after heavy rainfall, take a look at our film Damp and Rain in Traditional Buildings. It is also important to understand how your house is constructed. As explored in our first film in this series, traditional buildings tend to use materials that, whilst they absorb water, can also dry out without impacting on their integrity and can often be retained and naturally cope with flooding and heavy rainfall. Choosing compatible building materials, as well as insulation, that can dry out in the same way after flooding means that you are less likely to have to replace them. On external walls, lime-based mortars and renders should be used, as they allow the walls to dry out and potentially increase the rate at which they do, as most of the evaporation of the moisture occurs through the permeable lime mortar or render. Internally, traditional materials such as lime plaster and breathable paints will also aid the drying process and can usually be retained after a flood. By contrast, cement-based mortars or renders will trap water within the wall, preventing it from drying out. As cement is non-porous, it can't absorb water and will redistribute it to more porous materials, risking further damage. Other modern materials used either externally or internally, such as bitumen tanking and sealants, as well as modern film-forming paints, are also inappropriate for older buildings. Whilst they may prevent some water ingress, they can also trap moisture in the wall or the floor, preventing it from drying out. This can lead to damp, mould, rot and deterioration of the materials themselves. In addition, gypsum, plasterboard and other modern insulation materials can disintegrate after a flood and will need stripping out and replacing. How you deal with the floor will depend on its construction. An untouched traditional flag floor is resilient and should allow the water to drain away after a flood. A solid, breathable limecrete floor will also naturally dry quickly. Suspended timber floors can also be retained in many cases, although you will need to lift a number of floorboards afterwards to clear out the debris and allow the boards room to expand, preventing them from warping. By contrast, modern concrete floors are not always resilient and may break down and need to be replaced. They can also take several months to completely dry out. When carrying out works to walls and floors, you have the opportunity to add suitable breathable insulation. However, most insulating materials are not able to cope with being soaked or standing in water for a period of time. Whilst they are able to dry out, they can also produce staining, so they may have to be partially removed after the flood. If boards or bats are fitted horizontally rather than vertically, only the lower sheets affected by the waters will have to be replaced. Or alternatively, it may be more appropriate to install insulation on the upper floors and leave the ground floor without. If your property is part of a terrace or semi-detached, you also need to consider the impact on neighbours. Are the works going to redirect water or moisture, causing increased problems with damp in those properties? You also need to be aware that if you're doing work to refurbish walls, floors, or roofs, then you may also need listed building consent or planning permission if your home is listed or in a conservation area. So check with your local planning authority before making any improvements. You'll also need to make sure that the work complies with the building regulations, so get advice from your local authority's building inspector or an approved independent inspector. In summary, improving the flood resilience of traditional buildings means understanding where the water is coming from and carefully choosing materials to retain the breathable nature of the solid wall properties.